I'm going to tell you the story of Lexington and Concord. The story I'm telling you will probably be completely unlike what you imagine it to look like. Probably some of you have seen the movie or read the book One April Morning. Great book, great movie. I like both, except it's a highly inaccurate depiction of what actually went down. And interestingly enough, notice how almost every depiction of Lexington and Concord, you essentially have the Lexington showdown, the British troops disappear from the scene, and then the next thing you see is them fleeing for Boston, and we don't get to see most of the stuff in between. A lot of questions remain unanswered, or at least unanswered by mainstream historians. The first question should be obvious, but people don't ask. Why is the militia of Lexington lined up on the green, out in the open, when there's nothing to protect? The powder has been hidden. The Patriot leaders have long fled. Concord down the road has already been warned, literally half a day in advance. So there's absolutely no reason for them to be standing there. In fact, they're standing off the road so they don't even impede the potential advancement of the British Army. It's a question that a lot of people don't like what the actual answer is, and we'll talk about that. Another question that doesn't get answered very often, or doesn't get answered at all, is who fired first on that day? Now, if you listen to most historians, they're going to say, we don't know. Guess what? We do. We actually have both sides confirming we know exactly who started the fight. But historians don't like the answer, so they don't like talking about it. And a very, very, very persistent myth that needs to die a horrible death is the idea that the British Army was defeated by farmers who were shooting from behind walls, rocks, and trees. It's not remotely how it happened. Didn't look like that at all. But it's not the story most historians want you to hear. All right, so let's take a quick look at some of my primary sources. There are a bunch more, obviously, because this subject's been covered heavily. We got Redcoats and Rebels by Christopher Hibbert. We've got the very, very excellent The Minutemen by John R. Galvin. Galvin did some fantastic work digging through New England libraries, pulling up diaries and letters that people had been literally ignoring for over a century. And we have The Spirit of 1776 by Henry Steele Commager. Obviously this goes over the entirety of the war, but they have a lot of good first-hand accounts in here. Excellent book. The Minutemen I find to be a good page turner, something I could sit down and read over and over again. Spirit of 76 is good as a reference book if you're looking for first-hand accounts of things. Basically it's broken down by events, and you can go look at the event and see the various things people have to say about it. Okay, so one of the things I always start when I'm explaining, when I'm doing a history class, is we have to understand what forces are in play that make it difficult for us to understand what happened. Well, obviously one of them is the passage of time. Time has passed there's quite a bit of time between here and there, so that will alter our ability to fully understand what's going on. You've also got the problem of overly interested historians who want to reshape the narrative. You've got a situation where nationalists and federalists had a particular way of wanting to view things. The mid 1800s historians wanted to reclaim the story in a completely different way, and then by the end of the 1800s, a whole different narrative was intended to be played out. So you have that problem. You also have a problem is in our history we have, and people who know me, there is an overwhelming feeling of Anglophilia which overwhelms our history, where people don't want the British to be as bad a guy as they were. And I'm a bit of an Anglophobe, as a lot of people may know. That's probably good to let you know that, so that does color my viewpoint of things a little bit. So we're going to try to give you the full picture of what happened. Okay, so laying down the background of what's going on at this point. Essentially what has happened is the British government has dissolved the Massachusetts Parliament. Massachusetts then forms an illegal provisional government that essentially is moving from place to place and meeting in different towns and staying one step ahead of the British authorities. The British take this as a massive affront and are very disturbed by this. Now, in some of the videos, you'll hear me talking about the revolutionary governments of the American Revolution, and this is an example of one of them, where essentially the old colonial government is completely, well, okay, it's still being forced up at this point by the British, but conceptually it's been eliminated and replaced by this radical new body. And they have some very interesting ideas that we'll talk about when we're talking about the revolutionary government at some point. But some ideas we might even want to figure out how to incorporate today, because they had some good ideas. Okay, so one of the things this provisional government was doing was organizing the outlying towns. The American colonies, and Massachusetts in particular, had the huge advantages. It had a ton of veterans left over from the French and Indian War. And these veterans were prominently placed in places where they could help train the troops. Another big advantage is the techniques of war had not changed dramatically between the French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, and the Revolutionary War, and the weaponry was pretty much the same. So there was a potential for both sides to be able to face off against each other relatively equally if they were properly disciplined. Now, probably the biggest difference between the militias and the British Army was bayonets. And bayonets are obviously very critical if you understand the weaponry of the time. A lot of people like to overemphasize the rifles that were in colonial hands, but it's not as big a difference as a lot of people would like you to believe. Rifles in America versus the rifles in Europe were not significantly different. In fact, the American rifles were pretty much copied off of European models. The British recognized the necessity of having rifle regiments. If you see anything that's called light infantry carried rifles. The Hessians that were brought over were primarily light infantry, essentially farm boys who knew how to shoot well. So there's a kind of mythology that's popped up around rifles. Maybe I'll do another video on that at some point. Okay, so starting on April 18th, 1775, we essentially have John Hancock and Sam Adams are out in the field meeting with the militia, giving them news, cheering people up, that kind of stuff, kind of showing the colors. The British Army becomes aware of their movements and make a plan to attempt to capture them. And they make a fairly ambitious plan with the idea of going to Lexington, seizing and destroying all the powder there, hopefully capturing Adams and Hancock, and then moving on to Concord and destroying the powder there. Unfortunately for the British, their plans were known days in advance. Everyone knew they were getting ready to do something. Everyone pretty much had a good idea where they were going. Because the British Army was road-bound, and there were only several routes out of Boston they could possibly go. So by matter of elimination, you could determine what was possible, and then what was probably their most likely target. In Lexington and Concord would have made good targets, especially Concord happened to be on another nexus of the road network, which brought all kinds of other places to, which allowed you to ingress and egress to other villages and towns. So Concord would make a really good target for the British. Now we pretty much know the rest of this part of the story about the one if by land and two if by sea, and Revere, Prescott, and Dawes, and many, many, many other riders go out that night in order to warn of the British advance. Now, the reason why we knew the British were coming by sea is because everyone saw the preparation of the boats. The British had to get the boats together in advance to cross the river, so when they saw them getting the boats, they already knew which way they were coming. So it wasn't like a last minute thing. They actually probably knew this days in advance as well. One of the things that the British discovered was they didn't have nearly enough boats. So their mission was already off to a really bad start. They began their crossing at 9 p.m. and finished it around 2 a.m. They actually expected the crossing to only take a little over 2 hours. The British brought up 700 troops. But here's the thing that most people don't grasp, and it has a huge impact on how this story goes. The British kind of looked at this trip out to the countryside as a lovely jaunt in the country. And it was kind of a way to reward the soldiers who were feeling pent up in Boston and allow them to get out into the countryside. So it was kind of to get chosen for the mission was kind of considered a bonus. It was a way of letting the guys get a reward and blow off a little steam by going out. So these 700 troops were drawn from 22 different regiments, and overwhelmingly they weren't under their own officers because they weren't complete units. They were essentially what we would call task forces. And so a lot of these troops were now under officers they'd never served with before, which changes discipline and alters your ability. If one officer uses a slightly different way of commanding, it might cause you to react slow or not react at all or misunderstand what's going on. The British were essentially under the command of Smith and Pitcairn. Now, once the British soldiers made their way across the river, on the way there, they heard bells ringing and they heard shots ringing out along the entire trip. Everything notes that at no point were they being fired upon at this point. They were describing everything as warning shots. Essentially, they were alarms. So along the entire route, they were hearing bells and guns going off, and so they pretty much knew that there was going to be absolutely no surprise. They already knew before they even got to their first mission objective in Lexington, that their cover was blown and the likelihood of them having a successful mission was very low at this point. So the British will arrive at Lexington a little after sunrise. During the night, the Lexington Militia has been roused several times, gone into formation, and gone back home on false alarms. Essentially, people showing up telling them the British were like within a half hour away, and they'd completely underestimated how slow the British were moving. So here we have, here's the picture we need to see. We have the Lexington Green. The road is off to the militia's left, and the British are on it. And the militia is completely out in the open. The militia is not blocking the road. The militia is not guarding anything. The militia has no purpose being there whatsoever. So why on earth are these guys there? Well, that doesn't seem like a worthwhile question asking for most historians, so let's just blow it off and not talk about it at all. But wait, we're going to have to talk about it, aren't we? Well, see, here's something you probably didn't know. Did you know that this wasn't the first trip the British made out into the countryside? Did you know that the British actually made several trips out into the countryside over the month preceding this? Maybe something happened on those other trips that caused this to go down the way it did. Yes, it did. Okay, so we know about 2 different encounters prior to Lexington. During the month of April, and I believe one of these was in late March as well. We have tales of the various militias explaining their encounters with the British Army during these other trips out into the countryside. And the stories essentially go where with each new encounter, the militias claim a slightly bolder move than the previous militia did. So we have a situation where one militia in one of the other towns says, "Oh well, we didn't break up our formation until the British could actually see us. Once we were in sight of the British, then we basically dismissed and all went home." The city of Andover claimed that they allowed the British to nearly get to musket range before they broke up and went home. And then within the weeks before Lexington, we have the encounter at Salem. Now, there's a fun thing that happens with a lot of the stuff with the Revolutionary War. There's a British account and there's an American account. They agree on the location, the time, the date, people involved, and usually from that way the stories basically diverge and go off into separate directions, and you gotta kind of piece things together by looking at the story and saying, okay, where do they match and what makes more sense? So the story that the Salem militia tells is that the British Army approached their town, and as the British were approaching, they pulled up all the planks on the bridge going into the town, and they formed up in the city center. So the British, in full view of the American militia, had to sit there and reassemble the bridge. And once the British crossed, this is the American version of events, by the way. Once the British crossed the bridge, they claimed their local minister went out and talked to them and talked to the British saying, hey, let's not turn this into anything ugly. And according to the American side, the British marched up face to face with the American militia and then basically did some kind of about-face maneuver and marched away. Now, we don't know for a fact that anyone from Salem talked to anybody outside their town about what happened. But let's listen to the British side of it. So what happens on the British side? The British do, everything lines up to the point where they say, the bridge. Well, the bridge is torn up. The British do put it back together. And then they said, as they finally assembled the bridge, the American militia dispersed before they could enter the town. Now, which story sounds more likely? Well, the British sounds more likely around here. It doesn't really sound like it would make sense that they would do that. And we'll backtrack that for a second, because it'll make a lot more sense when you hear what happens in Lexington. The parts you know that are right, and then when I tell you the rest of it that you don't know. So, we have this story, and it's highly probable that the people of Lexington heard this story, because it will make everything make more sense. So, the men of Lexington most likely believed that they had to, on a point of honor, hold their ground and do at least as well as the men of Salem. They probably assumed, since they already knew where the British were going, they knew the British were going to search Lexington and then head on to Concord. So they weren't blocking the road. They were standing to the side as a point of honor, saying, we don't have to leave because we know the people in Salem didn't leave, and we have to at least do as well as they did. So the British come rounding the corner on the road, and they see these 80-some militia under Captain Parker lined up on the green. Interesting side note, 25% of the men in the militia were in some way related to Captain Parker. So you essentially had almost like a clan situation in Lexington. So if the story of Salem is, as the British said, well, the British would be mightily confused that this militia is just standing their ground on the green when they should sanely be dispersing. Whereas if the Lexington militia heard Salem's side of the story, they were probably assuming the British would just leave them unmolested. So we have a big problem with expectations. I think a lot of historians don't like this explanation because it kind of detracts from the bravery of the Lexington militia, because they're not there for a purpose other than honor. And unfortunately, the honor they're upholding is a false one, because Salem most likely dispersed before the British came in close contact. Now, this is where it starts not looking at all like what you think it does. So the British call their columns to a halt. They're still on the road. And as the officers are discussing what to do, the British soldiers start breaking ranks. A lot of them aren't under their own officers. And so when their officers go wandering off, some of them are wondering what's going on. So you have a situation where it isn't the orderly, well-disciplined British you're expecting to see. You're actually starting to see units breaking formation and beginning to mill around. So what's happening is the officers are starting to get concerned. They want to figure out how to make this end as fast as possible. And what ends up happening is two different officers issue two different sets of orders. One officer orders his men to disperse the militia from the green, basically get them off. Another officer tells his men to go round up the men on the green. So you basically have two groups approaching with completely different orders. Neither one of them with permission to shoot. So now the commanding officer, Smith, sees this happening and says, oh, this is going to turn into something bad. And so he's yelling to try to get some kind of order to happen. And it's so chaotic that nobody can hear what's going on. And he sees these two units moving in and said, oh, this is disaster. Now here's the fun part. Virtually no historian's going to tell you this. Yet, we have accounts in both of these books, both a British account and an American account, telling us exactly the same story. Now, what this officer doesn't make sense unless you know what's happening right now. If you have a picture of the British Army lined up perfectly in absolute order and discipline, what this officer does next makes no sense. However, if you have two units following different orders and so much chaos happening that no one can hear what's going on, what he does next makes absolute sense. He points his pistol in the air and shoots. He is thinking if he shoots the gun, everyone's going to shut up and he's going to be able to bellow out an order and get things straightened out. Now, right before he shoots, Captain Parker, in charge of the militia, goes, you know, this isn't looking at all like what the guys in Salem said was going to happen. This looks really bad. Hey boys, we better get off the green. And so, they're in the process of turning and walking off the green. Meanwhile, you've got one group saying disperse. You got another group trying to round them up. And then a shot rings out. At this point, the British fire. Now, I want to do a little digression or regression here. I want to show you some plates of the Battle of Lexington as depicted over time. So this is an early plate. Now you can see the Redcoats pretty straightforward, lined up towards the house. And then you see some, it's kind of a, looks kind of like fluffy brown cotton. That's guns discharging, that's the smoke coming up. And if you look at the militia, basically they're pretty much all backs to the militia. They're basically fleeing off the grounds. It's essentially a massacre. And that's how it was portrayed at the time. It was portrayed as a massacre, saying, you know, these guys showed up, they didn't do anything bad, and the British just mowed them down, shooting them in the back like cowards. And British on the scene, you'll hear a lot of the common soldiers writing in letters and diaries saying that we are going to pay dearly for what we did in Lexington. So if you look at the story as I've told it, this plate makes a lot of sense. So let's go a little bit more into history. This one's a little harder to see. This is occurring closer, probably about 1830, 1840 time frame. Okay, now we have the British firing off in the distance, and we have the militia. A large chunk of them are peeling off and leaving, while some of the militia are firing back at the British. And this is where American historians are attempting to revise the story, where they didn't want cowardly people being shot in the back at Lexington. They wanted stoic fighters. And then when history became very nationalistic towards the late 1800s, well, here we have the American militia standing its ground, stoically reloading and firing on the British. Yay. And essentially, when it was taught at all, that's how, with the passing of time, that's how the history was taught. Okay. So, we have a situation. We got 9 dead Americans, 10 wounded. Probably before that, we could call them British Americans, but I'd say immediately upon firing, they became Americans. You excuse me, that's my cat having a sneezing fit. Okay. So, at this point, Smith has to, 9 dead Americans, 10 wounded. The British had 2 very slightly wounded men who were essentially able to move immediately with very minimal first aid. At this point, Smith decides to call a council of his officers and say, hey, what do you think we should do? Now, we don't know the exact conversation that occurred here, but the general decision that came out of it is they decided to send runners back to Boston saying, hey, send reinforcements. We're probably, this could turn ugly, and we're not sure how bad it might get. And they also decide, even though the chances of anything useful coming out of it was almost zero, they decided to march on Concord anyway. Now, here's where it starts getting interesting. So, in several of the reports, essentially now you have the various colonials spreading the story of what happened. And you see a repeating theme start popping up where several people are shocked at the report saying, are you sure they were firing ball? And there's a heavy inference here that the colonials may have believed that the British were not going into this loaded, that they may have been carrying powder charges only to scare the militia. So that indicates that, at least on the colonial side, they weren't expecting trouble. And if you couple that with why it appears the Lexington Militia was out there holding its ground, doubly so. Nobody was expecting trouble. The British were carrying a minimal load of ammunition. There's essentially a combat load, a marching load, and all these different loads they carry. And they were carrying the lower end of the ammunition load because they apparently weren't expecting trouble either. Okay, so as the British are starting to do their march on Concord, they are starting to hear lots of guns being fired. However, this time, there is no longer warning shots. They are being fired upon. But interestingly enough, on the entire march to Concord, there's not a single British casualty. They do hear musket balls clattering around them from time to time, so they know they are being fired on. But what's happening is these these are people, basically individuals, firing beyond effective range, having pretty much no effect. And if you have a good understanding of how smoothbore muskets worked at the time, or even rifled muskets worked at the time, closing into effective range with a weapon that you couldn't reload fast was deadly for an individual. So you have to assume that a lot of these guys who are shooting from the woods down on the road to Concord probably had rifles as well as smoothbore, yet nobody hits a target. Now, it's always possible they weren't actually trying to hit, but if you're shooting in the direction of somebody, you have to expect that there's a possibility. So once the Concord Militia finds out what happens at Lexington, they had formed up in their city center as well. They're green, and they decide it's probably a really bad idea if we stay here. So what they decide to do is they go through town, cross a bridge in the opposite direction that the British are coming from, and they go essentially assemble in the woods. So they're going out of their way to avoid a confrontation. So Once the British get to Concord, they do a search, and once again, they pretty much find nothing. About the only thing they find is carriages that could be used for cannon. They take the carriages into the center of town and set them on fire. Now, this is going to start a bizarre situation. So, at this point, the British commander is kind of upset. He really wishes he had something more than the two cannon carriages he has on fire here. And he sees a barn on the north side of town, across the bridge, and he says, well, that's close enough to town. That might be a likely place for them to hide stuff. So he makes a 50-man detachment and sends them across the bridge, the very same bridge that the Concord Militia crossed earlier. And they head over to go deal and to search this barn. Well, about the same time, the Concord Militia, hiding in the woods, see smoke coming up from the town. And they come to the conclusion that the British are burning the town. And so, since they're deeply concerned, they're saying, well, we got to go protect our families and our land. We don't have a choice. They form up and they begin marching. They begin marching towards the North Bridge. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Concord is a nexus of roads. Essentially, from there, you can get to a lot of other places out in the countryside. So, when the news first broke about what happened in Lexington and made it to Concord, it now spread over the entire countryside. According to one estimate, there may have been somewhere in the neighborhood of tens of thousands of militia converging on Concord. And so the British are starting to notice, and Concord at that time was ringed with hills. They're starting to see more and more men forming up on these hills. And the British decide, wow, this is actually a really awful place to be. We're probably already outnumbered. And if they decide to close us off, we could be in a world of trouble. So, the British commander decides, we probably need to get out of here in a hurry. So he sets up another detachment, this time 90 men. And he's sending them to go guard the North Bridge so that the other detachment he sent out to go search the barn can't be blocked. And he also sends a few in that direction to hurry them up. So, as this guard unit is showing up at the North Bridge, lo and behold, the American Concord Militia is also approaching the bridge. And so the Americans decide, well, gee, this is bad. So they follow their training, and they've been drilling rigorously, and they form up. And British survivors of this encounter describe the Americans as well-disciplined, well-trained, and it literally shocked them that the Americans took up proper formations for setting up to fire. In fact, it probably rattled them a bit. So, the British at the bridge, and the British at the bridge see the American militia. The American militia is forming, meaning they're setting up their lines to shoot, and the British shoot first. Now, one of the things that happened is the handful of Americans who died there and were wounded were all hit high. This is indicating that the British fired unready. Essentially, that their commander rushed them into shooting without properly drilling them because he was starting to panic. and his panic probably spread to the soldiers. So the Battle of North Bridge essentially left 2 Americans dead, 3 British dead, and 10 wounded. Now, the British contingent that was there to guard the bridge now panicked and turned and ran back to their main force. Meanwhile, remember, the other detachment is still on the other side of the river at the barn. There is an incident known as the Scalping Incident. The American militia crosses the bridge, deciding what they're going to do next. And according to the American side, they saw a British soldier propping himself up as if to fire, and he was wounded. And an American used a tomahawk or an axe or something to that matter and struck the British in the head to prevent him from shooting. British fleeing the scene believed the Americans were scalping the wounded. So this set up deeper panic. So at this point, we have a handful of British dead. The American militia from Concord is crossed the North Bridge and starting to move into town. The number of soldiers gathering, the American militia gathering on the hills surrounding the town, is getting greater and greater. The British at this point consider abandoning their detachment at the barn. That's how panicked they are at this point. However, the Americans aren't sure what to do, and they take up a new defensive position on the other side, on the side of the river they already are. The British detachment that went to check out the barn now comes back because they heard the shooting. They cross the bridge. There is an exchange of gunfire, no casualties that we're aware of, and they actually get back to rejoin their group. Okay, so at this point, the British decide we need to get out of here. So they start heading out of town. And there's a hill called Hardy's Hill immediately off to their left as they're exiting the town. And there's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 militia on the hill. The British, and this kind of ends up being a foreshadowing of several of the early British battles, the British decide they can't let these guys there because they're potentially in range. So they send a detachment up to force the Americans off the hill. Several British are killed. The Americans do disperse, but the British have kind of worn them, are starting to wear themselves out, and they've barely covered any distance at this point. So one of the things that's been happening while the British have been playing around in Concord is the American militias are forming up along the Concord Road. But again, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't look like we've seen it depicted in movies. It's not singular farmers hiding behind a rock or a wall or trees. One thing on the walls is kind of interesting, and if you've ever walked the Freedom Trail, some of the existing walls or recreated walls are there. They would have been impossible to use as cover where they were at, and many people at the time even mentioned that the walls were useless for cover. So, British exit the town, and they're starting to feel a little better, saying, hey, we didn't get cut off, we're doing good. And there's kind of a hairpin turn they go around. And this hairpin turn, to this day, is now called the Bloody Angle. And what occurs is, as the British are fully engaged in this hairpin turn, the Woburn militia rises out as a mass out of the grass at the front of the British, and another militia group rises up at the back end. And both groups fire in formation, first line kneeling, second line standing, and open fire into the British, killing at least 30 of them. The British were so panicked by this that they left at a run and abandoned their wounded on the ground as they fled. Along the way, there is some sporadic shooting, but overwhelmingly, the British report no casualties between the Bloody Angle and the outskirts of Lexington. At the outskirts of Lexington, we have what is known as Parker's Revenge. Now, if you recall, Captain Parker is in charge of the Lexington Militia. So there was a hill on the outside of town that the Lexington Militia had reformed on. So you had a militia that basically just got trounced a couple hours before, has now come back to the battle. A lot of them are bandaged up from the first battle. They form. They stand their ground. They withstood 3 British volleys of fire and didn't budge. Essentially, they were so angry from the earlier encounter that they were not going to move for anything. Eventually, they were forced to retreat. One of the big problems for the militia was they didn't have bayonets. So once the British would close too closely with the militia now had no means of fighting unless they had other hand weapons with them, and the British would have an advantage with a bayonet on a long musket. So therefore, the Americans were obliged to flee the field before they ended up dying under the bayonets. Now, this is where the British have their bit of luck for the day. The reinforcements they called on earlier are now here. And they have 2 small cannon in tow. They fire a couple of times to keep the Americans back. The British who have fled from Concord are so exhausted that they're literally falling to the side of the road and dropping in heaps and going to sleep. Absolute total exhaustion, and this is without permission, and the British officers realize how completely worn out these guys are, and so they endeavor to try to hold Lexington while let these guys get it together and be able to get up for another run at it. Meanwhile, they are starting to see more and more people forming up on the road from Concord to Lexington. They can see a lot of milling around. Now, one of the problems is you have the militias. When they are under good order, they would form up, they would fire, and they could inflict pretty good damage on the British. Once they moved from their positions, they didn't really know how to deal with pursuing an enemy that was fleeing. So it ends up being a lot of guys milling around. But the British officers realize that with the numbers they're seeing on the American side, that pure numbers alone are going to overwhelm them if they don't get on the move. And so they realize that their only choice is to get up, move, and move as fast as they possibly can, avoid engagements if at all possible, and try to make it back to Boston as best as they can. So the British exit Lexington still under fire, and we're not getting much in the way of reports of casualties, none that I'm aware of. So one of the towns in between Boston and Lexington is a town called Menotomy. I might be pronouncing that wrong. Menotomy. I don't believe the town exists in that name anymore. And the town is kind of nestled in the woods, and the British are like, oh, I don't really want to go through that town. That could be bad. And they consider briefly leaving the road and trying to circle around, but they don't know the countryside. They're afraid they could get caught in the swamp, and then they would be, absolutely screwed if they got caught by the Americans out there. So they decide they're going to head through the town of Menotomy. And this turns into brutal house-to-house fighting. the Americans have fortified all the houses. They are shooting from all the houses. One of the things the British report is that when they forced their way into houses, if there were no men there, often they would run into the woman of the house, who was also well armed, and potentially discharging upon them. One guy I like to always bring up when I'm talking about this is a guy named Sam Whittamore. Sam Whittamore was 60 years old. He decided that he was going to stand his ground. He loaded 2 muskets. He loaded 2 pistols. And he had a sword at his side. And he stood in his little courtyard. And all his neighbors would say, "Hey, British are rolling up behind us. The regulars are here. You need to get out of here, dude." And Whittamore goes, "I'm too old to run. I'm going to stand my ground here. This is my house." And so the British come around a corner, kind of coming through these, it's a tight housing area with streets, so they're coming through a nexus in the blocks. And Whittamore discharged one of his long arms, fired both of his pistols, and was shot while holding his sword over his head. He was hit 3 times, and on the ground, when he laid there, the British bayoneted him 7 times. Now, this is kind of a testament to how brutal the fighting's getting, because the British are now kind of in the blood rage stage, where they're just going after things. Now, Whittamore, brave man that he was, that's not the end of his story. Apparently, he would continue to tell the story well into his 80s. So somehow he lived through that. And essentially anyone who would buy him a beer, he would happily tell the story to. So ultimately, once they're through Menotomy, the British would work their way down the road. They reformed on a hill overlooking Boston and also overlooking the road system coming in order to ascertain what the situation was. A bit of an interesting foreshadowing, the British formed up on a hill called Bunker Hill, which will definitely come into play in the very near future for these guys. So ultimately we have 73 British dead, 173 wounded, 49 Americans dead, 39 wounded. So it's not an overwhelmingly lopsided battle, but it definitely shocked the world that these farmers would send the British to running. So I hope this alters your view of what the battle looked like. And I think this is a really good example of why we need revision. Because there's a lot of people who are very comfortable with the original story, and they don't want it to change, or they don't want to bother trying to figure out if it anyway makes sense. At some point, I definitely want to get more into the whole rifle versus musket thing, because there's a lot of mythology out there on that. But hope you learned something interesting from this. Thank you, and I hope you check out some of my other videos.